Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by scholars who have received support from the Hagley Center in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds. One such scholar joins me today. Richard Popp is Associate Professor at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. Rick, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you're researching and writing about these days?
So the project is about television in New York City, and what I'm interested in is how the two shaped each other, right? How the emergence of the television industry was shaped in many ways, and the further development of it over the course of the mid 20th century was shaped, very much by the city of New York, and then also how television became kind of an active presence in New York politics, in inceptions of New York, the broader meaning of the city and the public imagination, and so on. So really, I'm trying to put those two histories in combination, the history of New York in the 20th century and the history of broadcasting. So that's the project, really.
Well, New York has always been a real center of the broadcast industries in the United States, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So, if you look at the major corporations, right, that's really dominated broadcasting, RCA, and of course, its subsidiary NBC and CBS and so on. The networks, they were based out of New York, and then also New York is really the first place that had a fully operational television system, right? In the sense of it was the first place where you could buy a TV, really turn it on, and have a few different stations to watch, right? And then also it's the first big city to have kind of a fully operational cable system and so on. And so in a lot of ways, it's the first place where people could experience TV in the way that would become I guess typical and taken for granted not too long after, across the country more generally.
Mm-hmm. Well, when was it that you could first purchase a TV and switch it on in New York City and have that early sort of first adopters experience of television?
Well, so a lot of times the kind of landmark moment is the 1939 World's Fair, right, where you have this big mass merchandising push from RCA and General Electric and other big electronics companies, and even though it was fairly expensive and would have been fairly difficult to install and so on, you could go out in the spring or summer of 1939 and buy a TV set. But there's people who bought earlier versions of television sets, as early as the late 1920s, early 1930s, but there's really not an awful lot that you could watch other than these kind of experimental broadcasts, sometimes just as simple as like a toy cat like swinging its arm back and forth, or paw back and forth, things like that, right? There was things going out over the airwaves all throughout the 1930s, to test out, different types of television systems, broadcasting systems, and then also to kind of hold the license, right, that was granted by the I guess at that point, the FRC, later the FCC. So, but in terms of, being able to turn on a TV, watch, say, two different channels, right? You could do that in 1940 in New York.
That's really interesting. And so from a really early point, New York and television are really intimately intertwined. Would you say that's true?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. So, so one of the things I'm trying to do with this project is to look at New York as a kind of active agent, right, in the development of TV, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just a kind of a setting where these big corporations have their headquarters or where the big national network studios are, but also to think about New York as this material presence, right? To think about New York as in a lot of ways this giant thing that interacts in funny ways with television, right? And also with radio, but more so with television. So I mean, the era that I'm looking at is the era where TV was synonymous with broadcasting for the most part, right? I do look at the emergence of cable in the later part of the book, but the period I'm looking at is really, say, the 1920s through the 1970s, right? Where, for most people, almost all the time, what TV means is basically you turn on this box, in your house, and you receive broadcast transmissions, right, that provide, news and entertainment and so on, right? And so if you think about something like New York, right, in terms of the built environment of New York, it's full of these hundreds and hundreds of giant buildings, right? It's full of surround the island of Manhattan surrounded by these huge bridges and so on. And then you think about a medium like broadcasting, right, which is premised on the idea that you're going to fling out these radio transmissions, right? Those two things are not always compatible, right? And so New York has this kind of paradox to it in that it's, in a lot of ways, the most important market in television, right? It's the sort of, in a lot of ways, the kind of capital of television industry. But it's also the place where it was most difficult for a lot of people in the audience to get good reception, right?
And I see.
So there's this kind of, I guess, what would you call it? Like I want to say dialectical, but it just sounds too egghead.
There's definitely tension between these two.
Exactly. And so at a couple of key moments in the development of the TV industry, you have these tensions. I think that's a good way to put it, where difficulties in trying to broadcast, right, or trying to get good reception and so on, lead to these kinds of technical solutions that then end up being these kind of watershed moments in the industry's history. So I'm very interested in how broadcasting was sort of shaped by the physical characteristics of the modern kind of skyscraping metropolis.
Sure. And also what immediately comes to mind when you describe your project is that a lot of folks who aren't from New York City get their first exposure to the city, are introduced to it visually through the medium of television. I think about well into the late 20th century, early 21st century, my family was still receiving broadcast television on rabbit ear antennas. And the picture, the image of New York was really prominent in those broadcasts, even to that point. I see exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, New York, for reasons that make a lot of sense, has been the setting for many TV shows, and then also even though most say dramatic television content, the center production in the 1950s moves to Los Angeles, but even still a lot of TV programming is produced out of New York, whether it be the news, whether it be the morning shows, whether it be a handful of soap operas, or also late night television and so on, programs like Saturday Night Live and so on. I mean, a lot of the appeal of those shows and the kind of personality of those shows is premised on the idea of being in New York, right? Especially something like and then you have all there's really probably never been an era where one of the more popular television shows wasn't set in New York, right? And you can definitely see that in interesting ways in the late 20th century, right? Where you have, Seinfeld, and you have Sex and the City, and you have Friends, and you have all these programs, right, that are kind of set against this backdrop of New York City.
And I suppose that has a deeper history. Can think of all sorts of examples from your period. Perhaps you could give us one or two.
Well, sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of radio programming, a lot of popular radio programs were set in New York, fictional programs like the Goldbergs and others. And then also, I think probably, even more so than that, the fact that, so many of the popular, variety kinds of programs and so on, the more kind of vaudevillian things were produced in New York. And also, I think, something that would have been paramount in the audience's mind is the idea that, New York is the show business capital, right? It's the place where, if you wanted to see those people live, that's where, they had cut their teeth and so on. And so that's another facet of the project that I'm interested in, is the way that, broadcasting, radio and television kind of inherits the, kind of mantle that had been established over the, previous half century or so of New York being the place where U.S. cultural industries were, kind of centered, right? I mean, obviously Hollywood begins to challenge that by the later 1910s and the 1920s, but even still in the 1930s and 1940s, I think, New York was very much considered the place that was like the, center for cultural production, the place where the cultural industries were, most deeply embedded, and where trends and so on, kind of emanated from.
I can bring to mind all sorts of radio broadcasts from hotel ballrooms in Manhattan or music halls in New York, and that are billed very much as, this cultural product coming straight to you wherever you might be from New York, the beating capital of American culture, as it were.
Yeah. And I mean, that has a very long history, right? So one of the things that I've been working on a lot this summer is looking at how the radio industry in the early 1920s first began to kind of physically manifest itself in Manhattan, right? And the first, commercial radio station around New York is WJZ. And that was one of the early Westinghouse stations that came directly out of those experiments they did around Pittsburgh. And so what Westinghouse was doing was basically, using its factories and plants, throughout the, eastern part of the country to, they would set up these studios really quickly. They would, put a transmitter on the top of one of these plants. And so they had a plant in Newark and did this. And this is, it gets the call letters WJZ. And pretty quickly, they figure out that, Broadway talent is only so willing to, travel out to, this Westinghouse plant, in Newark. And so within a few months of operation, they'd already set up a remote studio at the Waldorf Astoria, right? Which ends up getting demolished, a couple years later to make room for the Empire State Building. And then if you just look at that one site alone, right, the Empire State Building then becomes the, basically the thing, right, that RCA puts its experimental television transmitters on, right, and then becomes the host for, well into the until the building of the World Trade Center, right? That becomes the Empire State Building is where television was broadcast from in New York for the most part. So you can do these interesting things, right, by just taking one particular site, one particular plot of land in Manhattan, and seeing how it's really, really entangled with with the development of broadcasting.
And yeah, that's fascinating. It makes New York such a rich subject for your work. It does bring to mind how in the early years of the Empire State Building, the owners had trouble making payments on their financing. And so one of the big ways that they were able to sort of make the nut, so to speak, was by leasing the rights to put broadcast equipment up on that airship mast up on the top of the building.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly it, and I mean, that remained, I think, very important to the building's, finances, well into the 60s. And so there's a big fight that plays out, right? When the plans for the World Trade Center, what would become the Twin Towers, are made public in the mid 1960s. the Empire State Building, management. I'm blanking on the name of the, the formal company, right, that runs the Empire State Building.
Mm-hmm.
But they are really at the forefront of this coalition that comes together very quickly, that also includes the New York City broadcasters, to fight this design, right? Mm-hmm. To sort of push for a redesign, because all their engineers are telling them that basically it's going to make these reception issues that are already bad in New York all the worse by creating this, they call it cone of interference, because the signals would they would leave the Empire State Building, right? They'd travel south, or they'd travel out, radiate in every direction, obviously. But, those that did travel south would then bounce off and then, create this ghosting effect, right? Which happens when your TV set receives the same signal microseconds apart, right? And you end up getting this kind of blurred, ghosty kind of image. And that's something that a lot of folks in New York City kind of dealt with anyway, right? Mm-hmm. Because where they lived and, obstacles around them. But there was this sense that the World Trade Center was going to expand by, by some projections, hundreds of thousands of households, the number of people that experience this ghosting effect. So and then in the Empire State Building, they don't want to lose the, because the natural solution to that is to then move this, these transmitter masts to, this now larger building, right? But then they lose the rent on that. So you're exactly right. I mean, it's very important, I think, to the finances of that building for a long time.
Mm-hmm. When you sort of set up the frame of your project, you briefly mentioned politics and how the politics of the city get entangled with broadcast media, but also then how that, of course, because of the influence of New York in the broadcast landscape of the rest of the country, that becomes a bigger political issue, perhaps at a national level. Could you parse some of that for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess the approach to the, relationship between New York and politics and television that I've been most interested in is there's a couple of key moments, right? So and it might be a kind of a funny way to define politics. I'm not really thinking so much in terms of like national electoral politics or something like that, but there's this really interesting moment that lasts for probably 6 or 7 years after World War II, right, where television's kind of been put into deep freeze, right, during the Second World War in a lot of ways. There's still broadcasts being, produced and so on in a handful of cities. But, new television sets really aren't being manufactured for obvious reasons, right, during the Second World War. And then once, RCA and Westinghouse and others, right, Crossley, these companies that make TVs, begin to produce televisions again, after the mid 1940s, there's a good number of New Yorkers who go out and buy them, right? By this point in time, there's about 3 stations that you can tune in. And this is again where like, the sort of uniqueness of New York as a built environment kind of comes into play. So many people who live in New York, right, live in apartment buildings. And, and more so than any other big city, right? And at this point in time, if you're going to watch television at all, right, you need an aerial, you need a rooftop aerial, right? And that's all well and good, right, if you live in a Cape Cod, tract home or something like that, right? But if you live in an apartment building, right, that's got 15 other dwellings in it, or 50 or 100 other dwellings in it, right, then you don't necessarily have the right or the ability to go up to the roof of this apartment building and install an antenna, right? Mm-hmm. But without that, your TV is basically useless, right? And so you have these people in 1947, 1948 who go out and buy this expensive new thing, right, and are excited about using it and so on, and then they realize that they can't get good reception without a rooftop aerial, right? And so a lot of times if you bought a TV during this period of time, right, the installation of the aerial was part of it. They'd have these aerials installed. A lot of times there'd just be a an informal agreement with the landlord that it would be okay to put these up there. And then the landlords end up facing this problem of like, okay, well, you're running this building and you've got, 50 tenants in it, right? And now, a couple people at first want to put up these aerials, right? But what do you do when 40 people want to put, you have this, the language that surrounds this is interesting because they talk about like aluminum forests and so on, right? So it's something that becomes unsightly, right? Becomes something of a hazard, especially when these things are kind of, self-installed and so on. And a liability, right, for building owners. And also, too, they realize in a lot of cases they just don't have the space, right, to accommodate all of these. So you have this, kind of flurry of lawsuits, right? And that's been one of the, this is kind of like my first foray into using some of the, in terms of sources, using legal cases and so on. But you have a lot of lawsuits, right? And this is mostly late 1940s or early 1950s. It kind of, gets resolved, at least, from a legal perspective by 1952, 1953 or so. But it raises these really interesting questions over what kinds of, rights renters have. Right. Is this a utility basically, right? Is it, are you going to define television as a utility? And so of course a, renter would have, legal rights, to electricity, right? To, water and so on, right? Those kinds of systems within a building. So then the question becomes, okay, well, is, something like television going to be defined within that as well, right? And there's, differing opinions, right, in the New York courts about this, and some very much side with tenants and say basically like this, this is going to become an important part of everyday life, right? And there is a reasonable expectation that somebody who, buys a TV ought to be able to, operate it, right? That this is important to people's, sort of general sense of a good standard of living, right? And then there's others who take a, I guess a more property rights, kind of friendly approach who say basically, well, no, like the roof of a building belongs to, the owner of that building, right? And the decisions about, what can be done on top of it, what can be placed on top of it belong to the, the managers of that building. And if they don't want these antennas up there, then, they don't have to grant access to that. So in terms of thinking about, things like the tenants' rights movement and so on of the 1940s, this is kind of like the sort of like one of the last gasps of that in some ways. And then there's this period in the mid 60s.
But before we move on, I'm sorry, but how was that resolved in the favor of the tenants or the property owners?
Well, so these things, they would bounce through the New York city and state court system. And it's been a while since I was kind of deeply immersed in looking at some of these cases. And so my, sense of it was really probably about this time last year where I was reading all these cases. But in terms of, to the best of my recollection, I'm blank.
It's okay. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No.
It may have also worked itself out technically if this was no longer a problem of reception inside people's apartments.
Well, yeah, I mean, to some degree, and this is another way that, it becomes, interesting to think about the politics of one of the terms I've kind of been playing around here with is the politics of reception, right? In the sense that one of the solutions to this is you have the development of what are called master antenna systems, right? MATV is the acronym that you usually see. All the big, especially say RCA, gets started on trying to develop these in the later part of the 40s, in part because they see what an issue this is in cities. But what an MATV is this, it's this massive kind of universal antenna, right, that you can put on the top of a apartment building, and it could provide good reception for up to 100 or so dwellings within there, right? And
Interesting.
so it's
Yeah.
a lot of ways it's kind of like a little miniature cable television system, right? Cable is already being introduced at this point in time, into rural areas, into mountainous areas, right? And with cable, you have a big giant antenna, generally on the biggest hill around, right? And then you have these wires that are kind of fed out to to service the households in that area. And an MATV system is kind of like the urban equivalent of that, right? Where it's this giant antenna on the top of an apartment building. And so but those are really expensive, right? And so they're generally placed on apartment buildings that have affluent tenants for the most part, or they are incorporated into new construction, right? And so a lot of the big kind of large scale apartment complexes that are built in the later 40s and especially in the 1950s include these, and it becomes something that's kind of sort of build right in the marketing, right? Like we have MATV right in these, but again, right, you have to be fairly affluent to move into a lot of these communities.
Well, what collections did you dig into in the Hagley archives to help you uncover the story?
Well, so the RCA, various collections, were incredibly helpful. One of the things that I was really focused on, in the trip I made out there earlier this year was Rockefeller Center, Radio City, right? And there's a lot of great material in the various RCA and Sarnoff collections, right, related to Radio City. I drew on the Margolies, the John Margolies travel ephemera. Because one of the things I was interested for one, because they have things like brochures from like the NBC studio tours, that you could do, if you visited New York and you went to Rockefeller Center, right? And including, in the mid to late 1930s, a special television tour that they offered, even before, there was sort of regular television broadcasting available to the public, right? And so that would have been one of the ways, right, where a lot of people first experienced TV, right, would have been going to New York, taking one of these tours, right, and seeing, an experimental television show being produced, seeing the other guests, that were on this tour, standing in front of the camera, and then, seeing those people, on a screen and so on, right? And so, there was really great stuff in the Margolies collection. And then also another thing that I was really interested in, I kind of emerged out of looking at these, tourist maps of Midtown Manhattan and so on, was to try to, like gauge how the iconography of New York, modern urbanism is in a lot of ways, kind of reshaped during this period of time. And the way that like a place like Rockefeller Center is so, kind of sent in Radio City has kind of become so central in terms of the representation of New York and what it means to go to New York and where you want to go when you go to New York, things like that. So those ones were important. Also, I found a lot of really useful books and periodicals, right, that were just, in that part of Hagley's collections that were related to Midtown Manhattan during that period of time, and to Rockefeller Center also.
Oh, that's great. And such a neat project. Rick, thank you very much for taking the time to share with us today. It's been great.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on, Greg, and also thank you to the Hagley for the opportunities that have been extended to to use the collections.
Oh, you're very welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, reach us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.